My name's Fraser Holman, and I'm pleased to welcome you back from your break. I hope you got a coffee or something. I'm a member of Dan's Committee on Defense and Security Studies, and pleased to be the moderator for the panel. And I have two speakers to introduce. I think their perspectives are going to bridge us back or towards the North American perspective in a couple of significant dimensions. The order will be Dr. Michael Dawson, and then Lieutenant Colonel retired Steve Day. You've seen their biographies in the program, so I don't need to go through that, but I'd like to highlight two or three things with respect to each. Michael spent a full and distinguished career in what morphed from external affairs to foreign affairs to global affairs, with very interesting assignments, including a number of years in Moscow towards the end of the Cold War, the real Cold War, in the Gorbachev period. Periods that included really reaction to 9/11 in charge or in dealing with Canada-US relationships, and ultimately as the political advisor, Canadian political advisor, to the commander of NORAD in Colorado Springs in the 2010 to 2014, where he had a special sort of insight and influence, I'd hope, on the Canada-US relationship through NORAD. Steve Day, forgive me there, has had an equally distinguished career in the special operations world. He's really specialized in all of the elements of special operations, particularly counter-terrorism, and was commanding officer of the Canadian Joint Task Force 2, which focuses exactly on that. He's had deployments, and very significant ones, both internationally and domestically. And he remains very involved. You can read through his bio of the company that he's operating, and he participates, he contributes his experience in training in many spots, particularly including NATO training for special operations and supporting the Eastern countries that we've tried to win. As I say, I'll ask Michael to kick us off. We've only got 30 minutes, so it's precious time. But thank you for your participation, Michael. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Fraser. We haven't yet addressed our sort of focal question. Are we in a new Cold War or are we not? My thought basically is, as a historian, we shouldn't really try and put things into categories like that, because sometimes that can be a bit of a snare and a delusion, because we think of things as they were and perhaps overlook things that are developing that may be quite different. So it's good to keep it in our minds, but we shouldn't be too taken by it. In any event, whether we're in a new Cold War or not, however we want to characterize it, one thing in my mind remains absolutely a key Canadian strategic interest, which is the care and maintenance of our defense relationship with the United States of America. If we cast ourselves back a little in history to what is sometimes called by academics the Kingston Dispensation, when President Roosevelt assured Canadians that if any other empire was to attack Canada, the United States would not stand idly by. Well, our very canny prime minister of the day, Mackenzie King, understood completely what was being said. And he responded with a statement that we have an obligation as a good neighbor to make sure that no enemy can attack the United States through our land, waters, or air. And the part I always like about that statement is he said, insofar as we are able, pointing out to the Americans that we are not them in terms of size and wealth. So thinking of that sort of understanding that led to the Ogdensburg meeting and the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, I think NORAD is in a way the perfect realization of those initiatives at the political level. It had an interesting gestation period, which we could go through, but it takes some time to do that. I think what's really interesting about it from the point of view of the relationship is its binational nature. The commander is an American, not necessarily by treaty, but by custom, and the deputy commander is a Canadian. And right through the staffs, all the way down, it's Canadians and Americans side by side. A little bit of an anecdote, my last commander, General Chuck Jacoby, mentioned that he had been up at one of the far distant radars in Alaska, and he liked to talk about the strategic corporal. Well, he found that the strategic corporal in that terrible land was a Canadian. And so we have Canadians throughout the organization, and I always thought that our Canadian military performed incredibly professionally and were much respected by all sides of the Americans down in Colorado Springs. So one of the things that we have to remember, though, is it's just not NORAD. The defense relationship covers, in a way, the spectrum of conflict. And this is where Lieutenant Colonel Day is going to follow up with me about one end of that spectrum of conflict that's kind of removed from NORAD and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and the strategic nuclear level. And so that is well looked after through our main military formations and exchange programs of officers, our exercises, and our participation together in battle, where we, again, held up our end very well as far as the Americans are concerned. One of the things that about whether it's a Cold War or not is I think there have been a number of very disturbing developments aside from the nature of Putin's Russia. One of the things that we've seen in the last few years among all the agreements that the United States and the old Soviet Union signed is that these have started basically to melt away. They still have a nuclear weapons agreement, but grudgingly. The INF agreement, which people, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, which people often thought was one of the things that brought the Cold War to an end, has been abdicated by both powers. The ballistic missile agreement was withdrawn by the United States. And so one of the things that those agreements brought were a lot of back channels. There were consultations on an annual basis about the status of the agreement. There were the verification meetings that went on practically constantly. And one of the things that came from all that is a lot of the important strategic thinkers on both sides knew each other. They talked to each other. They knew their red lines. They knew their concerns. And even though the last part of the Cold War was kind of frightening at times, there was that level of, I wouldn't say managed competition, but sort of moderated competition between the two big nuclear powers. And my worry is that that basically is melting away even as we watch it. And I'm not sure that outside of the remaining nuclear agreement, that Americans and Russians are talking very much behind the scenes. And I certainly don't think they're talking very much with China, the Americans, on those sorts of issues. So that takes away a little bit of predictability from the relationship between the two big nuclear powers. There's a couple of other things about Cold War or not, a couple of other disturbing developments. And one is the willingness of Putin to talk very openly about the use of nuclear weapons. And in the bad old days of the Cold War, leaders spoke very, very rarely about nuclear weapons, and they chose their words with extreme care. They just didn't throw away, well, we might do this if you do that. They were very measured. Some of these statements are a little concerning because they seem open-ended. And in a way, we have a Russian nuclear doctrine that has been published and assessed that is basically what they say, escalate to de-escalate, which used to be called, I guess, escalation dominance, and it wasn't necessarily very well thought of back in the Cold War. This is the procedure where if Russia feels threatened in its homeland, they would escalate through diplomacy, public statements, exercises, deployments on the border, overflights, intimidation, and then perhaps to actual kinetic use, or ultimately a small amount of nuclear weapons. I think that's a very perilous situation because no matter what the strategists like to say, I'm not sure that nuclear escalation is really controllable. Let's hope we do not have to find out. So I think that's something that is of concern. In the new era, whether it's Cold War II or not, I think the major mission of NORAD remains basically as it was understood from the 1960s onward, which is understanding if North America is under attack, yes or no, and assessing the nature of that attack so national command authorities can react in a timely manner, in an appropriate manner. This, of course, is now called Integrated Tactical Warning and Attack Assessment. And among the senior officers, including the senior Canadians on site, this is probably the thing that they spend the most time on rehearsing and talking to each other about, and what the entire mechanism of NORAD is all about, is integrating all manner of intelligence and indications and warnings from different systems, synthesizing them and making these calls. It's either North America's yes under attack, no, or wait 5 until we get dual phenomenology, which will tell us. Unfortunately, either the radar or the infrared have made sure that no mistakes were made. We still have to worry, I think, about what they worried about in 1985 and that period of NORAD renewal, which was the capabilities of the Soviet long-range aviation with its new cruise missiles to decapitate Western leadership, American leadership. That is still, I think, on the board as a serious threat. Plus the fact that in this escalate to de-escalate doctrine, intimidation is part of it. And that can mean the long-range aviation prowling around our airspace, not entering our airspace, they're very correct about that, but coming very close to Alaska, to northern Canada, sometimes down the Labrador coast, not so much lately, but in the past. And so that is where the traditional fighter air defense mission is still relevant, along with all the detection and assessment capabilities. But what do we do now as we're moving forward? I tend to agree that the hypersonic weapon thing is a bit of a red herring. For one thing, these are so expensive so far and not necessarily so well proven that they're going to be probably not just a silver bullet, but a golden bullet for the foreseeable future, which is not to say that they're never going to be a factor, but after all, ICBMs are hypersonic weapons and go very quickly from one side of the world to the other. But we do have in Russian strategic aviation, they have developed and deployed a new and better cruise missile called the AS-23 Kodiak, which apparently has a longer range and is very much more precise. And so that is a tool that they have. It's better than the one they used to have. Perhaps it means that as NORAD enters into this period of renewal, that some things might have to change. The detection line, whatever we're going to call it, might have to move further north. Part of it might have to go to space. This is the sort of thing that the scientists have been talking about for a long time. We might have to advance our fighter force further north, away from the existing FOLs. Perhaps we might have to pave Resolute Bay. And of great importance, NORAD has to be able to handle the data, crunch it together, and assess it, because there's going to be much more of it, perhaps in shorter timeframes. So I think right now, I should probably not go on too much longer, but I think that one very interesting thing that NORAD has provided Canada, and why I think it's an important thing that the current government should fulfill its promises of doing this and actually get on with it. NORAD, in a way, has inoculated us from certain problems. For example, during the Vietnam War, Canada did not go to fight in Vietnam, and Americans were very angry at the leadership level. But we never backed off from our NORAD commitment. NORAD gives us the ability, because we are firmly in defense of North America, without question, we are a partner, that we can be a little bit more careful in what engagements we choose to join. And that really gets down to Lieutenant Colonel Steve Day's point about at the other end of the conflict spectrum. We don't have to go whenever the Americans summon. We go where we think our national interests are in parallel. But NORAD is one of the things that gives us that luxury. So I think I'll stop there and pass it on.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much, Mike. And over to you, Steve. Good segue.
Thank you, General Holman. Mr. President, the RCMI team, and the remainder of my learned colleagues, absolute pleasure to be here with you. And Dr. Dawson, thank you for throwing that across to me. What I'd like to do is kind of build on what you've been saying, and maybe to contextualize it all from a special operations perspective, and understand, where does SOF fit in, if in fact we're in this Cold War redux or not. And so I'm not like Dr. Dawson, I'm not actually fussed about whether we're in a second Cold War or not. But what I am fussed with is the operational environment, or that future security environment, and how does SOF fit into that as we look forward. So just for context, I think it's important that I just characterize that environment quickly, and then I'll bounce over to the SOF piece and how we fit in. So I actually don't believe we're in a second Cold War. And I say that because I actually think the world, and most people would agree with this, is no longer bipolar, and from a nuclear perspective, by the way, and from a superpower perspective, and it is significantly more complex. We've got a multipolar world, we've got more nuclear powers, not less, and we're more globally integrated and networked than we ever were. And this includes our citizens, than we ever were during the original Cold War. Secondly, I think if we look at it from both a Russian and a West, or American-led West, there's a relative decline in both of our powers in comparison with our other global competitors, whether it be China, India, Brazil, whatever that might be, or the larger G20. The reality is we're in a relative decline to them. So therefore, there's a larger global narrative about competing governance or national structures, and how we manage our economies, manages our nations. Secondly, I think if we look at it from a threat perspective, the threats, quite simply, are significantly more diverse. And that's largely because we're more connected, but it's also because of what we're doing with the climate, what we're doing with pandemics, economic warfare, and how we're globally connected, and how if we choose to do something in country Y, what is that second and third order economic impact that kind of ricochets back against us? With the global connectedness of our populations, the ease of disinformation, and how less educated people, I use that as a term, maybe can be led down certain rabbit holes, which makes it very hard in some cases for military operations to be affected in that same battle space. And then lastly, there's been a lot of talk of late, particularly the last 10 years, of hybrid warfare, gray zone conflict, kind of what is old is new again. And when I look at that and I hear about hybrid warfare, and I know from a NATO perspective, it's absolutely a buzzword, and Dr. Rentz spoke about that at the top end, really hybrid warfare is all about different ways and means of pursuing national objectives. So what those might be all depends on where your relative strength is to your adversary. But I think what we need to understand and look at it from a soft perspective are within the hybrid methodologies. In particular, the proxy forces of today are very different from what they would have been during the original Cold War, if you will. Criminal gangs and how they're leveraged, paramilitary organizations and how they're leveraged. When I talk paramilitary, I'm talking militias, not military militias, but the other militias like we might see in the US as an example, religious clubs, how they are unfortunately leveraged to nefarious ends, or other special interests. So these proxies in the gray zone conflict create problems, national security problems for all Western liberal democratic nations, and even for our adversaries on the other side. So when we look back, what does that mean for special operations? I would align it to what Dr. Dawson was saying is, what does it mean for NORAD? It's an interesting time for strategically oriented forces so that our way of life can be protected and balanced against the threats that are emanating from our adversaries. So for SOF, when I look at the current conflict, whether that be Ukraine or anywhere in the 21st century over the last 15 years in particular, SOF, it's a soft playground. And I don't mean to play fast and loose with that term, but the reality is what we see over the last 15 years are the ability for joint forces, enabled by SOF in some cases, interagency forces, our intelligence, our border, our police forces, to conduct offshore, low visibility, or deep operations to prevent things turning hot. So when we look at Ukraine, we've had clearly conventional forces from Canada in Op Unifier. And the anomaly here that sometimes gets lost is the Canadian General Purpose Forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, are absolutely world-class because those military men and women are trained and educated at a significantly higher level than most of our peer nations. So although from the NATO Special Operations perspective, NATO Special Operations was engaged with Ukraine pre-conflict, Canada piled in with conventional forces because our conventional general purpose forces and those men and women are exceptional at what they do. And that's why Op Unifier was such a success. So let's talk about SOF in a little bit more and just, again, tie it back to NORAD and Dr. Watson. So when I look at NORAD, that's a strategic Canadian-US relationship, defense of the homeland, truly strategic forces in nature. When I look at submarines are the same thing, strategic forces. And when I look at SOF from a CAN-US perspective, there is a strategic relationship. And what's important with all those things, NORAD, submarines, special operations, is generally speaking, they have an exceptionally short command and control chain. Access to the National Command Authority is exceptionally short. They have exceptionally good access to intelligence. So those strategic forces, those initial tripwires, if you will, that are out there, feed the National Command Authority so they understand which decisions need to be made in kind of what order. When we look at how we position those things, again, NORAD or SOF, the CAN-US relationship is preeminent. That's where Canada's national interests will always lie, is staying aligned with that CAN-US imperative. Secondly, the Five Eyes community. Third, and I would argue a distant third in most cases, NATO, and then other coalitions of the willing. But I think what we lose sight of in there is again, whether it be NORAD, whether it be submarines, whether it be SOF, those Western nations which are aligned, I think now because of what's happened in the Ukraine in particular, has strengthened NORAD, has strengthened NATO, and has recommitted the resolve of the West to say, you know what, in the 21st century, in that gray zone conflict that we've all been accustomed to for the last 15 years at least, occasionally a theater of operation is going to go hot. And if we are not prepared to immediately show resolve, that one Ukraine theater could certainly bleed across into Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, the larger Baltic Sea regions, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think those are important things to not lose sight of. So what I'd like to do just to close off and then open the floor up for the conversations is I really want to just break this down to three levels quickly from a special operations perspective: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. So really, where is SOF adding value today in this at the strategic level? Well, the counter violent extremist organization fight is a SOF fight and has a SOF lead. Tied to that's clearly the counterterrorism mandate, and counterterrorism being worried about weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass effect. And when we look at what's going on globally, and I go back to my earlier comment about current proxies, the last thing that we need is a Russian, China, Iran, North Korean threat actor coming back to the homeland using a proxy criminal organization, paramilitary organization, or whatever that might be. Again, and sharing the intelligence is key. At the operational level, and this is in the soft space, that operational level and strategic level, quite honestly, they blend together. But when we look at that current fight and we look at what's been going on in NATO, national resilience and national resistance around the Baltic Sea region, the Black Sea region, Central Europe, or the Balkans even, is exceptionally important to be able to shore up those weaker partners of the NATO alliance. And not only that, they need to be interoperable. We need to be able to project force in a timely manner, and we need to be able to employ force. So again, on the soft C2 side, those command and control structures are exceptionally short. And back to the national command authorities. What most people may not be aware of, in the NATO construct since 2007, 2008, there is now a NATO Special Operations Headquarters that did not exist in the First Cold War. That Special Operations Headquarters, NATO, largely blue NATO, but what people would not realize, it is 99.9% funded by the US. In all intents and purposes, it's a US headquarters, US forward deployed headquarters, commanded by a US 3-star. And so it gives the special operations community a chance to share tactics, techniques, and procedures, and to understand what's going on in the national resilience and resistance space, and work on interoperability. And lastly, at the tactical level, there's a number of things that are going on. The sharing of tactics, techniques, and procedures that are often compartmentalized is critical. Standardization of equipment, and this goes across NATO, but within the soft space, if you're going to fight tonight, you need to be able to fight and have shared equipment, tactics, techniques, and procedures immediately. Our interagency game is very tight in the special operations community, specifically in the Five Eyes, and very, very tight in the CAN-US space. As mentioned earlier, routine operations over the last 20 years in the special operations community has built a brother and sisterhood of both senior officers, leaders, and NCOs that we know who each other are, we know our strengths and weaknesses, and we know what we bring to the fight where required. Not only that, there's continuing exercises. Same thing we would do in the general purpose forces. We're exercising all the time when we're not on operations. And then lastly, from a Canadian perspective right now, and most folks wouldn't appreciate this or even know it, the number of exchange officers, liaisons that are exchanged, or embeds between the Canadian Special Operations community, the American Special Operations community, and the wider Five Eyes is unparalleled in CANSOF, Canadian Special Operations Forces history. So from a Canadian perspective, we are plugged in where CANSOF needs to be plugged in. And then it goes back to my opening comments about short C2 and access to intelligence, access to those other strategic enablers to make sure that the special operations community, although clearly cannot operate on its own, must be enabled by the general purpose forces, but it is truly a joined up total force across the alliance right now. And I think we've never been a better space from that. And then I'll leave off on the last point, and it goes back to national resistance and national resilience. There's no doubt in my mind over the last 15 years, Russia, as we heard from Dr. Rentz, has been flexing. They have been modernizing. But what I can tell you from personal experience, I have been in 10 of those Baltic, Black, and Central European countries talking national resilience and national resistance for the last 6 years. Those former Warsaw Pact countries know exactly what the threat is today. They knew exactly what Russia was up to, and they are actually prepared. I think, unfortunately, we in Canada, separated by those 3 great oceans, maybe have lost sight of the hybrid conflicts, the gray zone conflicts, and the global competitive landscape that has changed. But I will end on the point that I actually don't think we're in a Cold War redux or version 2, but I absolutely do believe we live in a multipolar world, and the future security environment is rapidly changing, and we need to, as a country, understand that. I will stop there, General Holman, and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve and Michael. Excellent perspectives to share there. Steve, just one quick clarification perhaps for people who don't know what Operation Unifier was, just to clarify that.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. So Operation Unifier in the Ukraine is a Canadian Armed Forces operation. Has been going on for about 2016 now. We've had 13,000 general purpose Canadian forces and special operations forces go through Op Unifier, and Op Unifier has trained over 33,000 Ukrainian forces. I think what's important from a Canadian perspective, Canada is the 4th largest contributor to building that capacity in Ukraine. And many people don't appreciate what those Canadian men and women have done over the last 6 years.
Thank you for that. So neither of you think that we're in a second Cold War. One aspect of that, which I think you've brought out a bit, both of you, is that the Cold War that we know and I lived through was a bipolar world, and that's no longer what obtains. Is it possible to imagine the kind of stasis in agreements amongst 3 great powers rather than just 2? Either of you.
I'll jump on it first. I'm happy to jump on it first, and then hand it over to Dr. Dawson. Could there? I agree, but I actually think because the world is so multipolar right now, notwithstanding the nuclear piece, and I think maybe the nuclear armed nations will always have that in their back pocket. But when I look at the rest of the global competitive space, what I love, for lack of a better term right now, is how the West has been able to bring new economic means to bear to keep maybe some of our adversaries at bay. So Dr. Dawson, I'll throw that over to you.
I think one of the things that brought down the INF agreement was the Russian desire that it should be expanded to include China, and China's rather large intermediate nuclear forces, which of course are a potential threat to much of the Russian landmass. And the fact that China was not interested sort of gave Russia and the United States an excuse to let it slide. And so we might get back to that at a certain point when China gets its nuclear modernization closer to completion. They might be more confident and willing to engage in a tripartite nuclear thing. but on the, their national interests may be too at odds with both Russia and the United States to ever really do that. I think that's an unknowable at the moment. It probably would be a good thing, but I would be, in the first instance, more concerned that the United States and Russia do not completely abdicate their consultation and all that back channeling that they used to do. I think it's still very useful.
So one of the things that runs through my mind in trying to understand Russia and Ukraine currently is the period of the post-Cold War when Russia was almost embedded there in the Nato world in the Partnership for Peace. And I wonder if either of you think of how that unraveled, or, it seems like it was the invasion of the Crimea that undid it, but there must have been some signs. Maybe you were watching closer than me. I'm just curious what your feeling there is, how that piece of history played out and where we find ourselves today.
If I may?
Yes, please.
One thing that struck me from my time in NORAD was we had a visit of the senior Russian diplomat and his military advisor to talk about ballistic missile defense. And the Russians never accepted the American view about how it's not aimed at their deterrent and all that. And they even offered to take them to demonstrations at Shriver Air Force Base, and the Russians said, well, that will just be another sound and light show. We don't need to see that. But I think the fact that the Russians gave up in NATO in discussing missile defense was one sign that they were giving up perhaps on the larger strategic relationship with the United States. That's just one straw in the wind, but it was not a very good thing when that sort of went by the board.
Maybe I'll come at that question from just a little bit of a different angle. I would, and we kind of talked about it with our peers at the top end here at the Canadian Forces College. I was fortunate to be at the school in 2007 and 2008. And during that time period, I actually had a Ukrainian naval officer in my syndicate for two of the first syndicates. And I'll tell you, the chance to stand around the bar and discuss world affairs with a Ukrainian officer, and senior Ukrainian officer at that point in time, and he made it in no uncertain terms, to my mind, clear that Russia was going in a different direction. And then next thing you know, it's 2008 and the Russians are in Georgia. Then they're in Estonia with the cyber attacks. Then they're in Crimea, then they're in Syria. So I've never forgotten that conversation I had at CFC, the Canadian Forces College, with our peers from across the world. So it's, I don't know, sir, that we were necessarily asleep at the wheel. I do believe that the national security apparatus, intelligence apparatus, national defense apparatus, I don't know that we ever trusted the Russians or the Chinese, to that matter.
So I think my final question here would be about missile defense from a Canadian perspective. I served in NORAD until 1996, and I think we were already, Canadians, were already kind of laggards in contributing to that part of the strategic defense of the continent. 25 years later or so, we haven't got any further. Is there any, I'm curious your views on Canadian participation at a strategic level for the defense of Canada without accepting a missile component to the problem.
Well, I've been following this issue since I was in Moscow, through my post in Washington, where the first Bush administration was going to quite some lengths to convince allies to sign on to the US missile defense program. And because of NORAD, we were courted quite assiduously. But of course, as everyone knows, we did not take it on. But there was one significant development in the early 2000s, 2004 exactly. It's when the treaty was amended to allow Canadians to work in the missile warning part of the organization. And so today you have Canadians right next to Americans in the warning function. And they're doing, the shift job very well. They're part of the whole package, but we do not, as yet, support active missile defense of North America. We support NATO missile defense in a sort of general way, provided that it does not necessarily defend Canada's own territory. I think there's a little bit of an evolution. If you read the academics and some of the columnists, the smarter ones, they realize that this is an anomaly. And while we have managed it very well, our deputy commanders in NORAD and our ministers of defense have worked on this, I think, very effectively to square this circle through the missile warning function. It's still out there as an anomaly, especially when just about every other American ally is an associate of the American Missile Defense Program. So there we are. I'm not sure it's going to change in the near future because, well, Mr. Martin was very interested, but then he made a political calculation and decided that we wouldn't do it. So I'm not sure. Mr. Harper didn't take it up. I don't think Mr. Trudeau is planning to take it up. We'll see.
You'll be glad to know that we did have Canadians involved in missile warning even in my time. Canadian crew commanders.
Surreptitiously,
yeah.
But then it was sanctified. One might look at the specifications for the new Canadian surface combatants and judge for yourself whether the radar and the missile fit gets us into missile defense at the sort of tactical level, not the strategic level.
Yeah. Did you want to add, Steve? Go ahead.
Yeah, just something quickly on that. And again, I am not an expert in BMD. However, I think whereas Canadians, we routinely get hung up is that because we do not publish in any routine sense what our national security strategy and national interests are, it's so hard to resource what that strategy should be. So because we don't resource it, or explain it very well, then we can't resource the niche capabilities that we should be looking at and prioritize them. And that's just, for whatever reason, as Canadians, we just don't seem to be very good at coming up with a national security strategy. So BMD, maybe we should do it. I don't know, maybe we should not. But lacking a strategy, we can't figure out what the ways and means are to make sure we can assure continental defense. Because what I would say is the other side of that coin, like NORAD, like submarines, even though our submarines are not that great, we still have submarines, and like specialized operations forces and intelligence and law enforcement, we do get very good intelligence, and we do have limited niche strategic capabilities that are valued by our American neighbor.
Very true.
So I think with that, we'll give ourselves a break until 4 o'clock.